As they say, and as you know, the ships are getting bigger, a lot more complex. The crew, smaller, obviously faster turnaround time. But what is the impact of all these developments on seafarers? This will be our task this evening, and we have eminent panel speakers who will x-ray the various aspects of this important subject matter. My name is William Azu. I work for the International Maritime Organization based here in London, and I'm proudly a trustee of Stella Maris. Let me begin by mentioning names of the eminent panel speakers who will be speaking to you and to us this evening. I'll give a little more details on their resume when we get into the real business. So we have Mark Levinson, this household name, an economist, journalist, and historian. We have Bob Dar, who is the Executive Vice President, Mediterranean Shipping Company Group. We have Iris Asejo, who will be speaking to us through a pre-recorded presentation. We have Father Paulo Prigol, who is based in Manila, Philippines. Of course, we have Anne McLaren, who is the Senior Area Port Chaplain for Northeast England and Humber. Our own Martin Foley will be giving us an update on the work of Stella Maris in Ukraine. As your moderator, I will try to make sure that we work within the time provided, which is about 90 minutes in total. So my role now is just to say thank you to you all for attending this webinar. The shipping industry, as you all know, has changed dramatically in the last century. And tonight we're going to hear about the drivers behind that change, what it has meant for seafarers around the world, and what the future holds. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping things to go through. You will notice that you are all muted, and that is deliberate, but we encourage you to ask questions of the panel. You should see a Q&A button on your screen. This is where you can leave questions for the speakers. All our speakers will present first, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. But you don't have to wait until the end to add your questions. Please do add them throughout the session. The question and answer option will be monitored so that we can get all the questions in. However, if your question is for a specific speaker, please include your names so that we can direct it to the right person. You can also vote for other people's questions by clicking on them. This will help us to identify which questions to answer first. Now, on the webinar itself, an estimated 90% of the world's goods are transported by sea. About 60% of that, including virtually all your imported fruits, gadgets, and appliances, is packed in large steel containers and loaded onto ships, traveling thousands of miles across the ocean before arriving at your home. In the last 20 years alone, the volume of goods transported by sea has increased from 4 billion to 11 billion tons. Let that sink in. From 4 billion to 11 billion tons. Obviously, that has required some big changes in the shipping industry. Ships are larger, turnaround times in ports are quicker, and crew sizes have reduced. And these changes don't always happen without incident, as we saw a year ago today, when the Ever Given ship grounded in the Suez Canal. That was in that Suez Canal for 6 days and approximately 7 hours. And thank God for technology, it was taken care of. In this webinar, you will hear about the history of container shipping, the ways in which companies are adapting their fleet and supporting their crew, research into the effects of these changes on seafarers, and how Stella Maris supports those involved. Now, without taking any of your time, we'll delve into the first speaker, and let me tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark Levinson is an economist, historian, and journalist. He lives in Washington, D.C. He spent many years as an economist journalist, including a term as finance and economics editor of The Economist in London. Mark then worked as an economist at J.P. Morgan Chase, where he created a unique industry economics function and developed a line of environmental research products for institutional investor clients. He later became senior fellow for international business at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has written for leading publications such as Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs, and contributed to a number of websites and academic journals. His 7 books include the widely acclaimed History, The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, and his most recent book, Outside the Box, How Globalization Changed from Moving Stuff to Spreading Ideas. Mark, we can't wait to hear from you. The floor is yours, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm very flattered to have been invited to join this conversation this evening. I think it's a very important subject. I'm going to start by just giving you a little history of globalization as brought about by the container, and then talk a bit about how this may have affected the seafarers whom I know Stella Maris works with. The modern shipping container began in 1956, and I don't use the word invented. The idea of the shipping container had been around for centuries, and no one had really made a go of it in a financial sense until a US road haulier by the name of Malcolm McLean decided to experiment with putting trucks on ships as a way to avoid traffic jams, delivering his goods. That's where the modern shipping container started. Until that point, and even for a number of years thereafter, most goods were handled by what was known as break bulk shipping. That is to say, individual items were loaded separately aboard a ship. A ship could carry 200,000 or more different items, and each of those had to be moved out of a factory, into a warehouse, out of a warehouse, onto a dock, off the dock, into the ship, stowed away inside the ship, and then that reverse procedure had to be conducted at the end of the voyage. It was not unusual in those days for a vessel to spend 2 weeks in port being unloaded and reloaded. And of course, during that time, the seafarers didn't have much to do with it. They could be on shore leave, or there could be a change of crew. but the seafarers were generally not engaged in the loading and unloading. And moreover, the docks were typically in the center of town. So if you were a seafarer aboard a break bulk ship and you had leave, there were lots of good things that you could do, probably pretty close to where your vessel happened to be docked. The shipping container developed slowly at first. It took 10 years before it was first used internationally. The main reason for that is that it required lengthy and rather arduous negotiations to agree on standards. What we now know as the typical 40-foot container, the container that you likely see hauled on a lorry down the motorway, was really the outcome of those negotiations. Until that point, various ship lines and railroads each had their own containers. And of course, these were not interchangeable, and that really stifled the growth of the industry. But once there was an agreement on a standard size and a standard way of lifting containers, the industry really took off, starting in the late 1960s and then in the 1970s as container shipping really spread around the world. Initially, it had been thought that container shipping would not have a great impact on how trade flowed. One of the great economists of the time, of the late 1950s, studied, for example, how container shipping was likely to affect the great city of New York. And he determined that it would probably be good for New York's garment industry because it would be cheaper to ship garments from New York to other parts of the United States. It never remotely occurred to this economist that globalization was coming, that the container would actually make it practical to ship clothes all over the world at very low price. But that's what happened as the price of shipping fell, and alongside it, the cost of telecommunications fell and computing became more important and less expensive. So starting in the late 1980s, we saw a change, a marked change in the nature of international trade. International trade started to grow quite quickly. But other aspects of this were important. One is that countries that had not been involved very heavily in international trade started to be more heavily involved, notably countries in East Asia. Also, the types of things being traded changed. A very large proportion of trade starting in the late 1980s involved what economists call intermediate goods. These are products which are raw materials for manufacturing, components, parts, things that are partially made in one country and then shipped to someplace else for further processing. So these are goods that go from one factory to another. These are not goods that go directly to a consumer. And that's what accounts for the bulk of the goods that move in containers. Companies began to establish these long supply chains in the late 1980s. And now it's very typical for a manufacturer to have multiple tiers of supply in which goods move from one manufacturer to another manufacturer where they're processed in some way, and then they move further to another manufacturer. This is now the norm, and this is made possible only by container shipping. It's really quite difficult to imagine this occurring with old style break bulk shipping. Container shipping underwent a quantum change in the early 2000s as the size of vessels grew quite abruptly. The first container ship back in 1956 had carried the equivalent of about 58 containers. Okay. Container ships grew slowly over time to a few thousand containers by the early 2000s. And then starting in 2006, there was a vessel rolled out that carried the equivalent of 8,000 full-size trucks, 16,000 20-foot equivalent units, as they say. This was thought to be cheaper on a per container basis. It would drive down costs even more. And once one company did it, other companies followed suit. And ships got very big, very fast, to the point that there are now vessels that can carry 24,000 20-foot equivalent units. That is 12,000 full-size lorries on a single ship. And this too contributed to change in the lives of seafarers. I want to talk for just a minute about how the development of container shipping made really significant changes in seafarers' lives. Back before containerization, vessels were relatively small in modern terms. You didn't have vessels that were 400 meters long as container ships are today. Often there were a good number of crew on the vessel because you needed to do a lot of repairs en route, and it was staffed accordingly. You had people who joined the merchant marine, the merchant navy, as I guess you call it in Britain, because they wanted to see the world. A trip around the world would take you to many fascinating ports. You could experience many cultures. For a large number of workers, this was the introduction to life beyond home. These jobs changed dramatically with containerization in several ways. First of all, center cities were really ill-suited to container freight. There needed to be large storage areas for containers. There needed to be ways to move a lot of containers in and out of the cities. And so the ports fairly quickly moved away from the center city. You know that in London, where the docks in central London closed in a matter of just a year or two, and the shipping moved to Felixstowe and then subsequently to places lower on the Thames, among other places. But even today, right in the center of London, you don't have the big ships coming in. You saw the same thing in New York, where the port moved to New Jersey. Saw the same thing in San Francisco. If you go to Rotterdam, you can find that the container terminals stretch 40 kilometers or more away from the central city. So it wasn't possible for shipboard workers very easily to go and experience different cultures in different places. They were stuck in a container terminal miles from anywhere they might want to be. And their time in port was much shorter. Typically, before containerization, they might spend days or weeks in port. After containerization, the time a ship would spend in port could be measured in hours. 24 hours in a port would be a long stay. So there wasn't really time for people to go and enjoy shore leave. The seafarers, for the most part, were stuck on the ship and still are. They might get leave in order to go to a Seamen's Institute that's close at hand, just to email with the folks back home or to get a good meal, but they really don't have the ability to go anywhere beyond the container terminal area. The nature of their jobs has changed too. Container shipping is a very technologically sophisticated industry. The companies that run it have very efficient and well-honed controls. And that means that there's a lot less demand for discretion on the part of the employees in the business. Okay, people are not, as they used to be, so actively engaged in deciding what needs to be done to keep the vessel running. Much more, they're told what needs to be done and how to do it. The container industry is in many ways a sort of manufacturing industry. It runs very industrially. Things are measured, things are quantified, and the old romance of being at sea is not much of a part of this. So seafarers' lives have changed quite dramatically in this way. I wanted to just highlight a couple of things that I think are coming up, and then I will give my fellow speakers a chance to jump on here. There are a couple of changes I think that lie ahead of us that will affect seafarers. One is that after the pandemic, we're going to be seeing much slower growth in international trade. International trade in merchandise peaked as a share of the world economy back in 2008. That's temporarily changed because the pandemic made it hard for people to spend on services. And so a lot of folks went out and bought new sofas. But that's going to be quite different after the pandemic. Growth in international trade is going to be very slow. And that means that growth in employment opportunities in seafaring is not going to be as robust as it was before, at least in this piece of seafaring as it has to do with container shipping. A second thing that's going on is that there's some experimentation now with drone shipping, including with container vessels, and that's going to make a dent in the workforce. I don't think we're going to see fully automated ships sailing across the oceans, but you already see in a few places experimental ships that are fully automated sailing fairly short routes. And as that develops, it will make a change in the types of jobs that are available in the industry. So I think that these types of modernizations will really affect the work that seafarers do and the opportunities that are available on shipboard. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to talk more when question time comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was quite, illuminating. Mark, because there's so much to unpack, I made some very small notes. I couldn't catch your speed because there's so much stuff you dished out. Essentially, you just gave us an evolution of the container shipping. And I'm just surprised that even the modern container shipping is older than me. Well, slightly, a little bit. But this is quite informative. 1956. And all the way through, all the evolution and the changes that happened up to the present time. So important dates would be the 1970s, just before the break bulk shipping, and then you move up to the 80s, changes in international trade and types of, cargoes changed from to intermediate goods as you described them. And then we moved on to the early 2000s when you have, from 56, where you have very few containers on board, and to up to the time you had 12,000 full-size lorries on board. Now on the impact of seafarers, well, it's a mix. It's a mix in the sense that they spend shorter time in the port, so that human interaction is not there because the ports have now moved further away from the city. So mingling, as it were, was near impossible. And then, of course, there will be slower growth, and more so post-pandemic, no one knows exactly which direction things will move. So it's still hazy, as it were, in terms of impact on seafarers. But modernization has also brought with it some aspects of, human elements in seafaring. So I just want to thank you, Mark, and I'm sure participants in this webinar will have loads of questions for you. So please get ready. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll move on now to our second panel speaker, and it's none other than Bod Da. Bod is the Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs, the MSC Group, which I know you all know very well. He is an experienced global maritime leader in the areas of policy, government, and related law. Can I kindly request that you mute your microphone so that others could hear me? Thank you, thank you. So as I said, Mark is an experienced global maritime leader in the areas of policy, government, and related law. Bod began his education in submarine nuclear engineering and later obtained his formal undergraduate education at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, where he was trained as a deck officer. During his subsequent career with the U.S. Coast Guard, he studied law at the George Washington University Law School. He most recently led the maritime policy efforts of the Cruise Lines International Association prior to joining the MSC Group in 2017. And today, Board is engaged across MSC's cargo and passenger divisions, developing the company's central government affairs function based at the group's headquarters in Geneva. Board serves on the board for the UK Chamber of Shipping, BIMCO, International Chamber of Shipping, Liberian Ship Owners Council, and Society for Gas as a Marine Fuel. And let me tell you something. I had told Board earlier that I'm going to tell the participants, the audience in this webinar, two things about Board. The two most important things he loves most: MSC Cruises and Formula One. And you'll be surprised for a mariner to love Formula One. So I found that out on my own research on Board. So Board, we now know a little bit more about you. The floor is yours. Let's hear from you. Board?
Well, thank you, my old friend, William. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. And Mark, thank you for that good introductory set of remarks. So just a couple words about the MSC Group. We are one of the world's largest shipping companies. We have a fleet of about 650 cargo ships in our network, almost all cellular container ships, but we also have some ro-ros and a few bulk carriers as well, but it's a small part of our business. In addition to those ships, we're the world's third largest cruise line with MSC Cruises, with 19 modern cruise ships. We have approximately 20 ocean-going RoPax ferries operating mostly in the Mediterranean under our GNV brand. We have 24 high-speed craft ferries that operate in the Mediterranean. We're the largest private railway operator for cargo in Europe. We have about 5,000 to 10,000 trucks and over 50 container terminals that we operate worldwide as well. But our core business is shipping and shipping boxes. And we're a unique company because we were founded by a mariner, Captain John Luigi Aponte, and his wife founded our company in 1970. He had 300 years of seagoing tradition in his family, and he was a captain. He remains a captain's captain, and that flows through everything we do at the company. It's really, if you love ships as I love ships, it's the right place to be. And we have some of the most interesting and exciting of all that coming into our networks and that we operate today as well. Another unique thing about our company is it is genuinely a family-owned, family-run enterprise. Even though it's a very large one, it makes it quite unique. And every one of the employees of the company, whether they're ashore or at sea, are really thought of as being members of an extended family. And you'll find a tremendous amount of loyalty among all ranks within the organization, whether you're an executive such as myself or whether you're a seafarer. It's just a unique feel to it. It's not like a typical company, even though, again, as I said, they've grown very large over time as an organization. They haven't lost their character. And for me as an American and being familiar with American corporate culture, something very unusual for me to see. And I really like it, and I've thrived in the environment. I'm grateful for the chance. So a couple of comments. I think Mark gave an excellent overview. I think just what international trade will look like as far as volumes that are required to be transported by sea, I think is a chapter that remains to be written. Mark's an economist. I'm not, and I don't have a crystal ball to predict the future. But what I can say is that we are continuing to grow our network as we have during the pandemic, when there was an acute need for additional capacity to meet the major volume surges, and also deal with the fact that there was effectively an additional lack of capacity because of congestion. Because if ships and the boxes they carry are not moving, then it has the same effect as looking as if you don't have the capacity available. So we've added a lot more into our network and continue to do that. But I think that no matter what the global trade picture looks like and the need for international shipping services, there will be another dynamic in play here that will require additional capacity to be put on the water in the various networks that ship owners operate. In our case, with container liners, it's pretty apparent that I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the effect of all the various decarbonization regulations and other things beyond regulation that we're facing, but I do know it is going to require some slowing down of the networks to reduce power consumption and reduce the greenhouse gas profile until we get a real breakthrough for alternative fuels, which is what the real answer is there. We are going to have to rely somewhat on just reducing power consumption. So when that happens, in order to maintain the same regularity and volume of service in the liner network, you have to have extra capacity in it. So, one way or another, I think the networks are going to need additional capacity, whether it's to meet trade growth or whether it's to meet some of these other demands. I'm very comfortable that, we're positioned to provide whatever service our customers need and where they need it. And if trade patterns change, because we see a continuation of the trend that started before the pandemic of some migration of production of consumer goods moving away from China into other locations in not just Southeast Asia, but also Southwest Asia as well, we'll be there for that, and we'll adapt to whatever is needed. I was trained as a seafarer. I have it in my blood. I have it in my heart. And I work around seafarers, and I work for a seafarer. I believe that they're absolutely the backbone of everything we do. And whether it's operating our container networks efficiently and safely day in, day out and responsibly, or whether it's providing the guest experience it takes on our cruise ships, they are absolutely essential to making this work. And they were really unsung heroes during this pandemic. I'm still troubled every day, and we're still fighting some of these battles with the somewhat prejudicial and very unfair treatment by some governments of seafarers during tremendous hardship. And they want to get home to their families too. And we had seafarers whose own countries wouldn't let them return, which made no sense to me whatsoever. But this just shouldn't be tolerated, and we need to really find a way to make sure that they're treated better should this situation ever occur again by the governments that have to open their borders to seafarers going to work, returning from work, or going home to their families. They just have to do a better job of it. And we've got an upcoming important meeting at the International Labor Organization for the Special Tripartite Committee coming up in May, and we're going to address some of these issues there. And I really hope that we'll find quite a bit of common ground with our fellow delegates who lead the workers side of the social partnership there to try and get governments to do more for seafarers than they have to date. And ship owners, we need to step up, and we need to continue to do our part as well. So Mark's correct that the nature of shipping has changed a lot. And, even when I sailed as a cadet, which was, getting on to be, over 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago, even on a container ship, I remember in Charleston, you pull up in downtown Charleston, and many other cities where we called the ports, you were right in a place where, you could socialize, you could, you weren't just constrained to a seaman center, you could do other things. Shipping has been pushed more and more to the outlying areas and away from the city centers over time. And I'm not sure that trend is ever really going to be reversed. And it really, I think, takes a social impact and mental impact on the seafarers. It makes it harder because we ask so much of them already. This is just one other thing. It's kind of a lonely life. And it's not for everyone, but we really need to treasure those who are in the profession, and we need to work much, much harder at attracting interest from a new generation of seafarers, whether it's from the traditional countries that provide seafarers or new countries that provide them. We really must work at it much harder in both the officer and ratings sorts of skill sets. Other things that have changed is the ships have become more sophisticated, and previous speakers have alluded to that. And as they have, the skill set that's required has changed. And for example, I was trained on steam propulsion, but nowadays Steam is getting almost completely extinct, not quite yet, but it's quite rare. And now we're talking about large slow-speed diesel engines, very different propulsion plants, and we're going to move into different ones later. I'll mention that in a moment. And when it comes to bridge watchkeeping, the equipment and the level of automation there is tremendously different than it was before. And I think we as ship owners and everyone in our community that's responsible for what equipment and what designs actually go into a ship that goes on the water need to be mindful of. There's a human interface with our seafarers that needs to be integrated with all of that. And it does us no good to put the fanciest, bright, new, shiny object on board a ship because we like the technology if it really outpaces our ability to recruit the right seafarers, train them, have them retain the knowledge that's required and stay with us, and then maintain that sort of equipment over time, because it takes different skill sets as you move on along the evolutionary chain of equipment. And so I think we need to keep that in mind and not just put technology on for the sake of technology, but make sure that it's serving a good purpose and make sure that in parallel track, we're recruiting the right people, training them to the right level, retaining them, and bringing new people into the profession. I mentioned engine technology. The last point I'm going to make is that is an evolution where I think there will be substantial changes yet to come, because as we move into different fuel types, and I'm not just talking about LNG, which requires a completely different level of training, experience, maintenance, operational skill, with much higher consequence of something going wrong than traditional fuels were. But as we move into the more exotic potential solutions like hydrogen as a fuel or ammonia as a fuel, to a lesser degree methanol, it's not all that much more complex than what we deal with in today's fuel, but maybe advanced nuclear technology as well, which could be on the horizon. These require a very, very different level of underlying education, underlying skills that have to be put on in a practical sense to these seafarers, and make sure that we're attracting the right people into the industry and we're making the job attractive enough so that they'll stay and then bring in others behind them, because this is an essential component of what has to happen with regard to decarbonization and greenhouse gas mitigation across the planet. We've got to do our part of shipping. This is going to happen. We have to make sure that the human element and the humans that really are going to make all this work for us are integrated into that package going forward, and done so in a sensible, methodical way. And it requires a good partnership between employers and the seafarers representatives as well. So thank you for the chance to speak with this evening, and I yield my time to the others.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bob. You did not disappoint as usual. But there's so much you said, a lot to unpack, starting from the bit of history of MSC and how you grew from literally nothing to so much. For now you have about 50 container terminals all over the world. You did talk about changes and adaptation to the changes, the impact on seafarers. You zeroed in. I like the bit about the human element. We become so robotic that we do not care so much about the humans behind those machines. One of my friends did tell me some time ago that no matter how technologically advanced a ship is, there must be a human being somewhere sitting in a room and then pulling the strings, as it were. So that human element can never be dropped off the radar, as it were. Now, you reiterated Mark's comments and the sophistication of the ships and skill set to match this sophistication. But I'm just wondering, would there be a limit? Would there be a time, a saturation point where you say enough? Let's see where we are now. For instance, the issues about the bridge watching and the changes in technology. And it just reminded me, someone who had been at sea maybe 30 years ago, and you bring the person into a bridge of a modern ship, the person will be lost, wouldn't even know where to start in the first place. That is the extent of the development. So More changes are coming, particularly with the new fuel types. So the impact on seafarers, you can imagine. So there's a whole lot to discuss, in this group when we come to the question and answer sessions. The questions are already started popping in, but we'll get there. Thank you so much, Bud. Very much appreciated. Now we move on. Our next speaker, the third speaker, is none other but Iris Arsejo. Unfortunately, Iris couldn't be with us tonight, so she has pre-recorded a presentation for us. Iris is a research associate in the Seafarers International Research Center at Cardiff University. She completed her PhD study on transnational assimilation of the Filipino seafarers and has been involved in various policy researches concerning migration, labor, and employment. If the video is ready, can I request that Iris' video is played, please, the presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. This talk briefly looks at winners and losers to modernity, the age at which the shipping industry finds itself now. We all know that the degree of winning and losing matters. Indeed, there are positive outcomes, such as young seafarers who most feel at home with modernity by way of their early exposure to digital technologies, social media, and the like. Of course, there's also now shipboard internet, a reality totally unheard of several years ago, but it's now slowly getting to be part of commercial shipboard life. There's also quite an extensive global improvement in monitoring safety. So there are now various institutions and regulations supporting safety standards. And most recently, we're all made aware of the mental health situation of seafarers, that it matters and it's serious, particularly within their unique context. There are still, however, many aspects that requires your attention, in particular the way seafarers become more vulnerable to outcomes of modernization. I'd like to highlight a few. Firstly, modernization of ports, in which we see vessels having quick turnaround. As a result, this confines seafarers more and more on board ships that there is not enough time to refresh themselves. With fewer seafarers working on board, work becomes relentless, which has to be endured the same way they endure the day-to-day monotony of just being and living on board. No wonder seafarers will identify getting tired as influencing depression on board. Secondly, the changes in the shipboard environment is another outcome of modernization in both the physical and management sense of it. So there's noise, vibration, heat, cold, facilities and equipments. These all affect seafarers' performance and well-being on board. There's also a culture of audit in which mountains of paperworks have to be done to comply with health and safety standards. There are vettings, inspections, toolbox meetings, and even cleaning the alleyway needs to have a risk assessment. So all these things seafarers have to grapple with as part of their job. Lastly, with the rise of contractual work, there's also the effect on seafarers' family life that again works back to seafarers' shipboard environment. Regular communication with families has been shown to have a supportive function and allows seafarers to maintain a work-life balance. Improving seafarers' well-being in terms of getting them to have more social activities is a must. Some companies designate officers as key social managers to organize fun activities that will get crew members to work together, either through games, contests, parties that let them interact with each other outside of their jobs. Or encouraging seafarers to do shore leave because this really gives them a new pace, something not as relentless as what they're used to on board. In terms of what we need to be thinking about for in the future, it helps if seafarers will have faster internet on board. While some ships have this already, it's not a common feature. Most seafarers still have to make do with what is provided data-wise and speed-wise. And it's also important that given the isolation and containment that comes with their jobs, that they can feel connected with their families and friends ashore. A chat service can really ease that feeling of being alone when on board. There are already digital support initiatives going forward in this direction, but not enough of them and also not enough awareness about them by seafarers. I've just given a sort of bits of modern experience. There are remarkable features that have to be acknowledged, but there are also bleak aspects, such as broadly the struggles of what it takes to be part of the modern world. But then you would tend to think how much more it can be for seafarers who divide their time between the world of waters and the world of land. It's really something worth looking at in order to find better ways and approaches. I appreciate your attention. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Iris, and I hope you have the opportunity to watch this program or following this program wherever you may be. Thank you so much. And I just picked out that it's not really all negatives, as it were. There are some positives with through modernization. You did list quite a number of downside also, seafarers getting a lot more tired because it's non-stop. They're like robots walking all through because the ships spend less time in port before the usual quick turnaround time. The issues of noise and vibration and heat, culture of audit, so much paperwork, ticking the boxes, as it were, contractual work, social activities should be encouraged, and of course, surely you did say something about the world of seafarers being divided between the world of waters and the world of land. That's quite instructive. And these are individuals, men and women, who make sure that there is food on the table for all of us. I was telling a friend that can you imagine for 1 month, just 1 month, no ships move anywhere? We'll all starve because until such a thing happens, the governments, everyone, the policymakers do not seem to understand the impact of seafarers to global economy. And this is one of the areas Stella Maris concentrates to promote and to make their work a lot easier, especially when they're in ports. So let me just say thank you very much, Iris, for this presentation. We will now move on to our next presentation, which will be another recorded presentation from Father Paulo Prigo. Father Prigo, it's based in Manila, Philippines, and worked for Stella Maris. He has a long CV, but I'm just giving you the abridged version. If the video is ready, please could you kindly play Father Paulo's presentation. Thank you.
What we have observed is this. There is a higher level of isolation. You see the internet, if it is not well used, it is going to contribute to isolation. The lack of shore leave is going to contribute to isolation. The fact that you do not have many people to interact on board is going to contribute to isolation. And I think it is something that the pandemic is I don't know if it's teaching us, but there is a trend there. I am in touch with the world, but I am detached from myself. In the Philippines, any overseas Filipino worker, including seafarers, of course, those who go through the right channels, you must undergo something called PDOS, pre-departure orientation seminar. A certificate is issued and you must present it at the airport to the immigration officer. If you have none, there is no deployment. This was always done in person. A number of companies are adopting it online. A lot of advantages there, like you do not have to travel, you can do conversation like you and I now, etc., etc. You can line up the advantages there. The disadvantage that we see is that you no longer have what we call socialization. It is you and I, it is the laptop and myself. So the part of being together, which is very important for Filipinos, being together, sharing meal, laughing, etc. This new online training, I guess it is adding to the isolation, it is adding to the psychological part, it is adding to the I and myself, which when you go on board with that kind of approach, I guess, in spirit, we can think of consequences that can turn out to be catastrophic.
Thank you so much, Father Paulo Frigo. Very brief but powerful. In touch with the world, but detached. That is powerful. And that tells you the good side and not so good side of technology and the contributors of isolation, online training, virtual training, just like we are having now. It's good because we can have so many people on board, we can discuss across the world, but that human element, that human touch is missing. So technology is good, but it also alienates and isolates. That's the message Father Paul was bringing on. We are making progress now, and we'll be going to the 5th panel speaker. And amongst the panel speakers, this is the last, and it's been quite interesting. The 5th speaker, it's Anne McLaren. Anne is our senior area port chaplain for Yorkshire and Humber. She's going to share the changes she has seen while working with Stella Maris and how they have affected the seafarers that we help. If you're ready, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you, wherever you are in the world. My name is Anne McLaren, and I'm the Stella Maris Senior Area Regional Chaplain for the North of England. I began my journey with Stella Maris, which was formerly known as the Apostleship of the Sea, as a volunteer ship visitor in 2004, and that's some 18 years ago now at Immingham Docks in the north of England. I'm married, I have 2 grown-up children, and in a former life was a solicitor. I was unaware of the ministry of Stella Maris and its outreach until I encountered a talk given by a local chaplain at my parish. I completed my ship visiting training and became a volunteer ship visitor on the north and the south bank of the Humber in the UK, and then completed an ecumenical certificate in chaplaincy at Ushaw College. Some years later, after an active life as a volunteer ship visitor, I was appointed as the port chaplain for the north bank of the Humber, and I've been in this position since 2008, so that's almost 13 years now. I have a team of 7 volunteer ship visitors, and I use the term we, because our chaplains are blessed in the UK and throughout the world to have a great team of volunteer ship visitors who help us each day visiting ships and volunteering with all aspects of the organisation. And we run the Hull Seafarers Centre based on King George Dock in Hull in England. This is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week centre, which is accessed by way of a key code, and that's given to seafarers when they arrive in our port. so they can access that at any time, and that provides them a safe space to use the high-speed Wi-Fi to contact their families, or it just gives them the opportunity to spend a few hours away from the vessel. I'd like to call our centre a home from home, because that's what we're trying to achieve when seafarers visit us, and with that comes the help and support of our chaplaincy team. Our ministry is multifaceted. It's always had at its heart and core the visiting of ships, which we and our team of volunteer ship visitors undertake daily throughout the world. So what changes have I seen on the ground since my involvement with Stella Maris over 18 years ago? And how has the modernisation of the shipping industry affected the people that we have the privilege to serve? The biggest change I can see is to do with time. Time spent in port, time spent on shore leave. Modern container ships can be in and out of a port within 24 hours, as Mark highlighted earlier, and that leaves little time for shore leave. And in some countries, shore leave can also be restricted. It encourages quick turnaround time, and the introduction of containerisation, as explained earlier, has greatly decreased the time it takes to discharge a cargo, and thus the time spent in port. Imagine if one of you were turning up in a foreign port with only a few hours to do all the things that you need to do: contact your family, top up your phone, get some shopping, or just have the chance to speak to someone else other than the crew you may have lived with night and day for the last 6 months. This is what we can do to help seafarers, not only on a practical level, but more importantly, to be a listening ear on board the vessel or at the centre. The size of crews has also got smaller, and that's put more pressure on the seafarer, not only regarding his job, but in connection with the relationships that he has on board. One of my ship visitors came back one day telling me he felt sorry for one seafarer who he thought was very isolated, as all the other crew members on the vessel were from the same country and spoke the same language except for him. Imagine how that must feel, as most seafarers, when they join a ship now, have no idea who the other crew members are or where they come from. When we go on board as chaplains and ship visitors, we bring ourselves and offer the support and help that they need. A different person and a different conversation to be had. It can be tempting when you finish your shift to go back to your cabin and not engage with the rest of your crew members, but it's important to encourage interaction with them and visitors who come aboard. Seafarers centres have also changed. Communication and its provision have become very important as technology has developed. The original Seafarers Centre in Hull had phone boxes installed, and seafarers had to buy a telephone card and punch the numbers from the card into the phone to make a call. Some phone boxes were even outside, so seafarers had to queue in the dark and the rain, waiting to get the chance to make a call. Mobile phones obviously put an end to that, but sometimes being able to contact your family at any time can be a disadvantage as well as a benefit psychologically, especially if there's problems back home which you're powerless to resolve. An elderly ship visitor once said to me that when he first went to sea, he went away for a whole year, and the only communication that he had was a letter, and only if that arrived in time at the next port. So the immediacy of issues back at home were more remote than they are now. As ports get bigger, they can be many miles away from the city, but we can provide transport, time permitting, for them to get some time off their vessel. We can't shift the clock back, and in some ways, I don't think it's right to do so. So the experience of having, for example, multiple days on shore leave is not going to return. But what we can do is help and support seafarers as they deal with the issues of modernisation on a day-to-day basis. What we should never forget, however, is the importance of human contact, something we've all grown to value more since the pandemic. It's the human interaction between chaplain, ship visitor and seafarer that's the most important. The smile you get when you board the gangway and say that you're from Stella Maris, the trust they have in us to assist them whenever we can, both practically and spiritually. I'd like to end up with something that I think sums up what we do for seafarers and what we're continuing to do. It's quite simple, really. Some years ago, I was asked to visit an injured seafarer who was going to be in hospital for some time, recuperating from a nasty injury sustained on board. His English was limited, but we managed to get by, and I visited him for some weeks. I began to realise he was interested in Formula One, a bit like Bud, really. So we chatted about that. I have to say, my knowledge at first of this was very limited, but I'm a quick learner. He then went back to his country. A few weeks later, I received a note, part of which read from him. And he said, "It's a month since I returned home, and I still remember how much you did to me." I think he actually meant for me, but anyway, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. "Thank you for every meeting, conversation, and kind advice. Contact with you has restored my faith in people and made my suffering smaller." And I think that's what is important to all of us, feeling wanted, needed, and supported. So thank you for listening.
I can only say fantastic. And I just want to say, and thank you so much for what you do through Stella Maris to the world seafarers. You summed up your presentation with a conversation, a note from that gentleman who remembered to write you when he got back home. You know, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, if you have never felt lonely, possibly the pandemic taught us a little bit of a lesson. Imagine in your own home, in your own house, you have all the spaces, you still felt alone. Can you imagine someone thousands of miles away in a box, literally speaking, with no contact? North, south, east, west, it's all water. Imagine the frustration. Then you get into port. That human contact is not there. This is where Stella Maris fills the gap. We present this human face to our fellow human beings who are incidentally serving us. So we are serving them to serve us. And this is what we do. I just want to say thank you, Anne. Thank you, Stella Maris, for the work you do. We have formally finished with our panel speakers, but we're not done yet. And we still have some time for your questions. But before we do that, please permit me to introduce Martin Foley. Martin is Stella Maris GB's Chief Executive Officer, and he's also the European Regional Coordinator. So we're going to take your questions and provide answers, but before then, Martin would give us an update, what's happening with Ukrainian seafarers and the colleagues we work with in Ukraine. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William, for that introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking our speakers this evening, Mark, Bud, Iris, Anne, and Paolo, and to also express my thanks to you, our supporters, for joining our webinar this evening. Now, our focus this evening has been modernisation, but we're all aware that we gather against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. Whilst we pray for peace and strive to help all those affected by this terrible war, Stella Maris has a particular concern for all seafarers and their families who are affected by this war. And I mean all seafarers. Yes, Ukrainians, who comprise about 4% of the world seafarers, also Russians, who comprise about 10%, but serving all seafarers. And I'd just like to share with you a few examples of the way in which Stella Maris through our global network has responded during this time of crisis. Firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to our Stella Maris colleagues in Ukraine, Father Alex and Rostik in Odessa. And we're privileged that Rostik has joined our webinar this evening. And in a second, I will invite Rostik to say a few words. It's curfew where Rostik is. I believe he's in Odessa. So Rostik will not have his video available, but we'll be able to hear directly from Rostik. But Father Alex and Rostik have continued to serve and support seafarers. I'm aware that just last week, they arranged for provisions to be provided to a vessel that was in the Black Sea. So we pay tribute to our colleagues in Ukraine. Our Stella Maris colleagues globally have been reaching out to provide pastoral support to all those seafarers who are affected by this war, particularly through the provision of internet and free internet and mobile communications for Ukrainian seafarers who, as one can imagine, are very anxious to connect with their families back home at this time. We've been helping seafarers to transit affected areas and return home. We just heard a few moments ago from Father Paolo, and I'm aware that he recently helped with the repatriation of 21 Filipino seafarers to Manila who were caught up in the war. And finally, our Stella Maris colleagues in the port of Gdynia in Poland are supporting refugees and their families in their retreat centre in Kashubi, not far from Gdynia. And Stella Maris in the UK is helping to raise funds to support this work. These are just some examples of the way in which Stella Maris is responding to the war in the Ukraine. For further information, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But before I hand back to William, I'd just like to invite Rostik, if you're there, Rostik, if you would like to say a few words, you're most welcome. Thank you, Rostik.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Martin. Do you hear me? Because
Yes.
I have not very good connection. I hope it will be more or less enough to hear me.
We hear you, Rostik. Thank you.
So, greetings from Ukraine. Everybody knows that we are in war under Russian armed invasion. So Stella Maris in Ukraine continue our ministry to seafarers and their families. As Martin said already, we assisted also in helping to all seafarers which stay in Black Sea region. Up to this moment, navigation is closed for all ships, and it is about 100 ships blocked in Black Sea and Azov area. Good to know that some ships already been provided by companies evacuation for their crews, but on board some ships there are some crews still on board to maintain the ship. So it's hard to say how it is to be seafarer in this time, especially, for example, in Mykolaiv. This is close ship when you are talking to master and master staying on bridge and can hear and see a rocket attack, but they must stay on board. So I hope that global maritime society will put attention about how to provide humanitarian corridors or to find other ways how to help seafarers to get back home. That is main important thing. During this time also, Stella Maris in Ukraine, we are continue help to seafarers families, especially for wives and kids providing and assisting to get to the border to come to Moldova or to other countries. So that is basic information about what is going on in Ukraine. More news, I suppose, you can get from internet. And also, according to topic of this webinar, I can say is that this modernization, as chaplain from Philippines, Father Paulo, if I'm not wrong, said, in touch and detach. But according to war in Ukraine, I can say we have only one way to be in touch with seafarers, and seafarers can be in touch with their families and with Stella Maris, because now it is high level of security and it is not easy even to leave the ship. So we are in touch only by new technologies, so we can continue communications through the mobile network or through internet. So that is good because we can be in touch, and for seafarers staying in Black Sea region, it is good to hear someone who are talking not about how things is going on with the ship, how things is going on with the goods on board the ship, with containers or whatever. But our question is how things is going on. Are you alive? Are you okay? That is important, especially in such hard time. Thank you. And also I'd like to say thank you to all Stella Maris network, to everybody who supports, who concerning Ukrainian situation, and thank you for your prayers. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. I'm speechless, but we'll continue to pray for the safety of all seafarers, wherever they may be, especially in this current challenge in Ukraine. It will come to an end one day. Thank you so much for that insight, and please be safe. Now, distinguished participants, and let me thank you again, Martin. Thank you so much, and for connecting Father Rostic to give us, because when you speak from a war zone, it brings it closer home. You understand what is going on there. It could have been any of us in those situations, and we express our appreciation always to the seafarers. Thank you so much, and thank you, Stella Maris. Now, it is that time we've been waiting for. I have about 15 questions, but I have an interesting comment. It's not a question, it's a comment from Peter Gill. Please permit me to just read it. It's posted to everyone, but I think it's important just to show that what we're going through now, modernization, didn't just start now, it's just that the scale has gone haywire, literally speaking. Peter said, speakers have described the change that containerization is going through. The change in ship size closely mirrors that experienced in the oil shipping 40, 50 years ago. The associated social marginalization is not new. It is only increasing its scope, which is fact. From what Bob had said earlier, and Mark, the way we have moved the trajectory, who knows where it's going to be in the next 20, 30 years. Thank you, Peter. It's not a question, it's a comment, but I like to read that out. Now, as you would expect, the current happenings now, especially around the shores here, about P&O, the dispute, there is a question. And Martin, I hope you will pardon me for putting you on the spot to answer this question. I'm going to read the question as much as I can. It's slightly lengthy, but you get the gist. It said, will the panel wish to comment on the current P&O dispute? My understanding of employment law was that large-scale proposed redundancies had to be notified in advance to the government that 90 days notice had to be given before the redundancy could be made. So also that an employer was not redundant, the post or she occupied was redundant, so that the employer could not replace the member of staff. If I am right, why has the government not sought an immediate injunction from the High Court? Martin, I know you are not a lawyer, but I know you're a policy maker. So can you give it a shot? As much as you can, bearing in mind the legalese involved.
Thank you, William. Yes, I'm not a lawyer. I was a lawyer in a former life, but I'm no longer practicing. And in regard to the legal aspects, I don't really feel qualified to comment on the legal aspects of what P&O have done or may not have done. Clearly, from a reputational point of view, they could, indeed should, have handled this better, I would say. And I think we in Stella Maris are deeply saddened to see the sacking of 800 workers, apparently without notice. And what I would say to participants in the webinar this evening is that any individuals or families who are affected by this decision and who need support can contact Stella Maris via our website and the other means of contacting us via social media. We can also make hardship grants available to affected seafarers via our centenary emergency fund. But I think I'll stop there, William. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You gave it a good shot. Thank you. Thank you. I will move on to the next question. This question is, how much bigger, Mark, I hope you're getting ready. How much bigger can container ships get? At what point would it become impracticable? Mark, you like boxes, so tell us.
You're asking about a subject that's actually a matter of some disagreement within the shipping industry. There are a number of people, myself included, not that I'm a particular expert here, but also people who are actually in the business and have their money at risk, that think container ships have generally gotten too big. And there are reasons to think that that may be the case. These very large vessels can take longer to load and unload than their predecessors, so the vessel might have to spend more time in port. The giant ships are not as flexible as the smaller vessels because some ports can't receive them. They're not deep enough, or they don't have big enough cranes or whatever. And so there are some companies that are now looking to purchase ships that are in the range of 16,000 TEUs. That's still a big ship, but we're talking 8,000 truck-sized containers. There are other companies that are buying ships that are 24 or larger. So about 50% larger than one that's 16,000 TEUs. And those companies believe that there's money to be saved by operating these extremely large vessels. It's not clear who's right about this. One of the issues that has faced the operators of the very large vessels is that it can be hard to fill them. Memories are short and people have forgotten that. But 2 years ago, a lot of these giant vessels were sailing around the world half empty. And the ship owners were really desperate for cargo because you need to have 12,000 40-foot boxes ready to go to when this ship comes into the various ports. Otherwise, the ship's sailing with empty slots and there's money not being made here. And that turns out to be a real challenge when you're running a ship line. So I think the question of how big ships can get is not really a technical question about how physically big can they become. It's really an economic question about what size vessel makes the most sense. And clearly different ship lines are adopting different strategies, and we'll see about that. It also seems to be the case, and others might not know about this, that we've got some new companies nibbling around the edges of this industry. It was the conventional wisdom that to be a container ship line, you had to be global. You had to have routes all over the world to serve customers wherever they wanted to be served. But now we see some companies which are getting in, they're sort of the Ryanairs of the shipping industry, if you'd like. Okay, they're not going to offer a hub service. They're going to offer service on selected routes with smaller vessels, and they think they can make money doing that. Is that going to work out? Again, we shall see, but it reflects a difference in opinion about where the container shipping industry is headed.
Amazing.
You know, William, I think it'd probably be
Yes,
a mistake
yes,
if I didn't weigh in on that question too.
Yes,
It's also our
Go.
core business. I think Mark's comments were excellent. I think it's right on. The limitation on the size is not going to be driven by the technical or engineering aspects of it, because you could build a bigger ship theoretically, but is the infrastructure really there to support it, even in routine times, much less when you're trying to alter your networks. And Mark's exactly right that those ships just don't have the kind of flexibility. They're way too big for, you know, the Neo-Panamax size as well. So they don't have the kind of flexibility that a ship in the 14 to 16,000 TEU range is. And if you look at the order books, or you look at, you know, what we've done with our fleet over the last few years, it's a combination, but you're definitely starting to see a lot more interest back in that 14 to 16,000 TEU range, which I think is reflective of the shortcomings in the infrastructure and the places where those ships need to call, and needing to have the flexibility to adapt to huge fluctuations in the market like we've seen here over the last 24 months. And, you know, with regard to new entrants, you know, I will point out, although there's been a lot of talk about over consolidation in the industry, if you look at the objective indexes on that, it would actually say otherwise. But in the Pacific trades a couple of months ago, last time I looked, about a third of the capacity was being filled by ships that were outside of the three major alliances. So there are some new entrants trying to come into the market. Whether or not that's a sustainable business model when things go back to normalcy, which is more like a 2 to 4% operating margin in a good year, and you lose money in plenty of years as well, you know, we'll see. But you know, we have our business to run; they've got their business to run.
Thanks. Don't go away, Bob. Don't go away. The next question. Let me just premise this. We have a few more minutes to the end. I'll take as much as I can squeeze in. The rest of the questions may be answered by email. So please bear with me. It may not be possible to run through all the questions, but this one is interesting, Bob. Will container ships be allowing travelers on board, as some of them had been before the pandemic? Will container travel ever be viable for certain popular routes and present an alternative to flying or even cruise ships? Bob, can you give that a brief shot? And then I have just one more for you, then one for Mark, and I'll be able to round up. Over to you.
I'd say I'd rather you book a cruise with us on MSC Cruises because we're set up to offer a lot of different options that we just can't do on our container ships. I was surprised to learn that, you know, right up to, you know, just a little before the pandemic, we were still taking some passengers on a limited number of our ships. But I think the question will kind of answer itself in that I just don't think that ships that are being built today are being built with passenger cabins in mind. So I think it's probably going to be, you know, a dying relic of an age gone by. And, you know, my hat goes off to people who want to enjoy the finer points of calling in Europort or Port Newark or some of these, you know, farther away locations where we call it container terminals. I personally enjoyed it. I loved it. I love going to sea, but it's not for everyone. And I don't know that the market is really going to be there. However, when you know, the market comes off of the ridiculous levels that we've seen due to the pandemic that nobody really could have predicted to happen, you know, who knows if the capacity is there on either existing ships or less likely on newer ships. That's a possibility, but it's not something we're focused on internally.
Sure. This is direct to MSC, Bob, and this question is for you specifically because you're mentioned by name. Has MSC had internal conversations about providing free shipboard internet for crews across its ships? What is your outlook for providing internet for your crews in the coming years?
Well, we've had a lot of discussion about that. And on the cruise side of our business, it's a little easier question to answer because we've built the IT infrastructure to allow guests to access internet service at sea. And we provide that bandwidth to crew members either for a certain amount of free time for certain purposes, or they can purchase at a deeply discounted rate access to that network. There are security concerns, which makes it a lot more complicated. And there's several technical aspects that make it a lot more complicated than it sounds on its face, because we've never been more vulnerable to potential cyber failures or cyber attacks than we are today. So, you do have to build some sort of separate infrastructure to make this work on other types of ships. So in our cargo ships, yes, we've had extensive internal discussions about it. There's a proposal that'll go in front of the ILO Special Tripartite Committee for the MLC here in May. I think that there are some really significant technical limitations to saying across the board it can be offered for free. I think that what will happen is companies will find that if they're not able to provide reasonable access to the internet and at a reasonable or no cost sort of scenario, it's going to be difficult to be competitive to retain your seafarers in the longer term. I mean, just like ashore, we've gotten used to communicating by these mechanisms. Seafarers have too, and we've got to find a way to accommodate that one way or another in the longer term, whether that's a blanket policy to provide it for free. I don't know that the industry could really do that right now. Even if the regulation were there, it would be much more complicated, it seems, on its face. But we've got to take steps in that. And we do provide internet access on quite a lot of our fleet.
Thank you. I've just we warned that we are running out of time, but on a selfish note, I can't but take this question. This question is, I come from a seafaring family, and this is for Martin. I come from a seafaring family, but now live miles from the sea. How can I help the work of Stella Maris apart from contributing financially? Martin, I know you like questions like this. Over to you.
Thank you, William. Well, what I always say to people when I'm out and about speaking to them about our work is that our work is as relevant to people in Birmingham, in the centre of England, as it is to people in Portsmouth or Southampton, Felixstowe, because the shops on the high street in Birmingham, they're also stocked through the work of seafarers on board ships. So the work of Stella Maris and the work of seafarers is not solely relevant to those living in port areas. I think if you would like to support the work of Stella Maris, then please visit our website and follow us on social media. If you would like to provide woolly hats, clothing to seafarers, bear in mind we work with a lot of fishermen, and the conditions on board many fishing vessels are not what you would find on container vessels. So there's practical assistance you can provide to the fishermen that we support. If you're in a parish, regardless of the location of that parish, you can become a parish contact for Stella Maris to support our work and be an advocate for Stella Maris in your parish, in your community, particularly on Sea Sunday, when we really promote the work of Stella Maris in supporting seafarers and fishers. So those are some ways in which you can help support the work of Stella Maris, regardless of where you are.
Thank you so much, Martin. There you have it. you can do a whole lot for Stella Maris, not just financially, which is important, though I must emphasize, but there are other ways you can also help. Let me thank everyone. Thank you profusely to show you how important and engaging this has been. We still have more than 113 people still logged on. So that tells you the currency of this subject matter. But every good thing has got to come to an end somehow. So we're just going to the closings now. And let me thank everyone on behalf of Stella Maris for coming tonight. As you have heard tonight, the shipping industry has drastically transformed in the last 60 years. There have been great advances in safety standards and improved technology, making things increasingly easier for seafarers to keep in touch with their families back home. And as technology continues to evolve, so will the shipping industry. However, with ships in port for shorter periods of time, fewer opportunities for seafarers to have a break away from their workplace, and reduced crew numbers, seafarers do report feelings of isolation and poor mental health. We feel very fortunate to be able to support seafarers in times of need, but we couldn't do it without our supporters. So many of you supporting us and participating today. So thank you so much. Thank you. If you would like to help support seafarers, there are details of how you can donate to Stella Maris in the chat. Thank you again for coming. Deacon Peter will now lead us in closing prayers, but before then, we have a prayer for Ukraine. And Martin, if you can do that, and then Peter will give us the closing prayer. But before then, Mark, Board, and amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation. Martin, prayer for Ukraine, and then Peter for the closing prayer.
It's actually William, it's Peter who's leading us in prayer. So I'll shut up and let Peter speak. Thank you, William.
That is perfect. Peter, please go ahead.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Almighty and merciful Father, we pray for all Ukrainian and Russian seafarers at home and abroad. Lord, give them strength. We pray that their distant families may be protected from evil, and that peace may return. We ask this through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the Father,
so
and
much.
the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks everyone for a wonderful webinar. And if I have to do it again, I'll do it with all of you. Thank you so much and have a beautiful evening. Bye.